Sagui Dekel-Chen is believed to be one of those hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza. His father, Jonathan Dekel-Chen, joins us now from Israel. Jonathan, thank you for making time for us. I want to begin by what I'm feeling is a change of tone in the country. You and your family have been waiting 11 months for news of your son. The country as a whole has been waiting 11 months to have their loved ones back, their citizens back. But this weekend, when those 6 hostages and their bodies were recovered by the IDF, it felt like a turning point for some of us. I wonder what it felt like for you.
Well, it's a good question. Surely there was a real outpouring, spontaneous outpouring of emotion, of rage, of sorrow by Israelis. I heard a statistic yesterday. There were something like 700,000 Israelis in the streets yesterday. And by comparison, that would mean 35 million Americans if the same thing were to happen in the US. I mean, it's kind of a mind-boggling number. And it did, evidently, it was sparked by the horror of the return of these 6 bodies of these beautiful young people, none of whom actually had to die. They were alive until days, perhaps even hours before they were discovered. And it's important to note, the week before, another 6 bodies were recovered by the IDF of hostages who had been alive for months in captivity. 4 of those 6 were people that I had known for 40 years on our kibbutz, on kibbutz Nir Oz.
When you say it like that, those bodies of those hostages are human beings that you had known for 40 years. I mean, when you hear that, both as someone who knew them, but as someone who has a son still there in Gaza, what does that do to you?
Well, as fate would have it, there are now, or still, 101 hostages in Gaza. We know, sadly, that several dozen of them have already been murdered. But of those 101, 29 are from my kibbutz, from my small community on the border with Gaza. They're all part of my extended family. And the Prime Minister and the government have been selling to the public here and abroad this, what turns out to be fantasy, that there is some kind of total victory over Hamas, and that by ratcheting up the military pressure alone on Hamas, which of course we all know is a savage terrorist organization, but purely by military effort, if we were to ratchet it up, then eventually Hamas would come running and begging for to return the hostages. Well, that has not happened, and much more tragically, because of continued Israeli military operations, more and more hostages are being killed, either by Israeli friendly fire, which is tragic, or simply because they've been executed by their Hamas captors, who would prefer to murder these hostages in cold blood than to allow them to be recovered alive by our soldiers.
Jonathan, then what do you want Benjamin Netanyahu to do?
I think the whole country, it's not just me. He needs to listen. He needs to listen to his own country, everyday people who are saying clearly, enough is enough, enough of the suffering of these hostages. We cannot allow more of them to be killed in captivity, and enough of the killing in Gaza. Moreover, he has to listen to his own senior military and intelligence officials who have been saying publicly for weeks, if not months, that there is no longer justification for continued military action, that the only priority right now is to conclude a negotiated agreement with the devil, with Hamas, in order to get the hostages home, as many as possible alive, and create a ceasefire that would, we hope, restabilize the area.
Jonathan, let me jump in, because you've said he needs to listen. He needs to hear what the people in the streets are saying, hear what his countrymen are saying. The vast majority of people in Israel and around the world are saying that enough is enough with the war effort. Just get the hostages home safely. He must have heard this. He must be listening. But why isn't he doing what is being asked of him? What's your sense of that?
Well, I understand what you're saying, but we need to remember, it's really important. Your viewers have to remember that there is another side here. Hamas still holds 101 hostages. Hamas on October 8th could have ended all of this and prevented the suffering of millions of Gazans simply by releasing at that time 240 Israeli hostages, almost all of them civilians, men, women, little boys, ripped from their homes. Hamas could equally, in an hour, release, without an agreement, release these hostages that haven't even allowed them Red Cross visits or Red Crescent visits. And again, the fighting would end. That's unfortunately not the enemy, not the adversary that we have. So this has to get done through negotiation with a non-state savage actor. That's a hard thing to do, even in the best of circumstances. The demand of it, I would say the vast majority of Israelis, and including me, of course, is that through the intermediaries, meaning the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, we demand from the Prime Minister and his government, his coalition government, that from this moment forward, with the help of those intermediaries, negotiate in good faith in order to conclude this agreement now. No more delay tactics, no more throwing in obstacles that didn't exist before to completion. Let us, for once, the first time, put Hamas in its place and force them to say a clear yes or no. Will Yahya Sinwar prefer not necessarily the lives of our hostages, but will he prefer the safety and well-being of the people of Gaza over his fundamentalist vision of the destruction of Israel alongside the death of our hostages? So our prime minister has to double down not on the saber rattling, but on a commitment to see this negotiated process through. If Hamas in the end says no, well, then we're in a different place and we'll have to proceed from there.
What's the last you've heard of your son?
The last positive sign of life that we received was in late November, early December. There was an initial hostage release, I think, through a negotiated settlement between Israel and Hamas, through which 100 hostages, women and children, were returned to Israel. Of those, 40 were from my kibbutz, and of those 40, a handful saw Sagui, met him, and many other men from the kibbutz in the tunnels under Gaza, a couple of days before they were released. And they were able to tell us that at that time, so late November, that he was still alive, wounded, but alive. Beyond that, we do not know what his condition is.
Jonathan Dekel-Chen, I sincerely hope that Sagui is okay and that he is returned to you very soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.